Professor Crane is a professor at the Mississippi State University, and she is one of the planetary geologists who investigates also Earth geology, and she particularly likes studying Earth analogs. And we are all excited to hear about her work on planetary surfaces and Earth analogs. So be prepared, because I know that she will interact a lot with you. So please don't be shy. And I'd like to leave the word to Kelsey now. Thank you for being here. And please, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for that that introduction. I do a mix of Earth and planetary research, and I'm really excited to get to focus on some Mercury and planetary stuff with y'all today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, if that's all right, so that I can present. Let's see if I have permission to do that. All right, can everybody see my slides, my presentation?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So I am, again, I'm Kelsey, Kelsey Crane. I am an assistant professor at Mississippi State University. My students and I make up the Planetary Structural and Tectonics group. And today we're going to talk about the tectonics of Mercury, but we're going to break this into a few different sections. The first part is going to be what we know, kind of how we know it. And then we'll move into what we can learn and where you all get to contribute to Mercury science in the future. So feel free to unmute yourself to talk to me, stop me with questions through the presentation. I don't need to hold the floor for the whole time. That's totally fine. So starting out, I'm going to start with two maps that are not tectonic at all. The crustal thickness map from Mazarico et al. 2018 on the left, and a magnesium silicon map from Wider et al. In 2015 on the right. On the left, in crustal thickness, the warmer colors are thicker crust. The bluer, cooler colors are thinner crust. And I apologize about the red-blue color scale on these maps. On the right, in the magnesium map, the redder colors indicate higher amounts of magnesium, so more primitive crust, and the cooler colors indicate lower magnesium or less developed crust. R is Rachmaninoff, so that's corresponding to this area over here, and C is Caloris, corresponding to the basin over here. So these are not tectonic maps. They're obviously not tectonic maps. No faults are mapped on these. But they're still really useful, and they can get you toward asking questions about crust and crustal deformation and patterns in the crust that we might be able to answer with tectonics. So if you're looking at these two maps, what questions do you think you could ask yourself about how crustal thickness is distributed, or how it's developed, or how the chemistry of the surface has developed over time? Or maybe even how the two are related. Does anybody have a question they could think of?
Please don't be shy.
Yeah.
If I answer, I cheat.
Okay, I will ask if the thickness of the crust is related with a presence of more tectonical structures where it's thicker.
Yeah.
Because we know it's a compressive environment, so I think that must be the case.
Right. That's an awesome question that you could start with and look at If you had a tectonic map of Mercury, where are your structures more dense? Are they spatially correlated with thicker crustal areas? That would be great. You've also got lots of impact craters here. So you could even talk about the age of those faults too, and the age of the thick crust. Does it make sense that they developed together? Do they have that a shared age? What about the compositional map?
I would say it's somehow weird to see a big concentration in a place of some elements and a big concentration of other elements in another place. But nevertheless, we have got the same situation between continental crust and oceanic crust. I would try to think something like this, maybe.
Yeah. And maybe even that the two, like with continental crust and oceanic crust, that implies a thickness, and that it implies a way that crust is generated. That if you're looking at a compositional map, that maybe there's a source region that's different, or there's a way that crust comes about that's different. So when you look at these types of maps, on the surface, they have nothing to do with tectonics. But tectonics can be a really good tool for starting to ask those kinds of questions, because the faults, like impact craters in the map on the left in crustal thickness, they're going to build up over time. They're going to scar that surface over time. So faults can give you an amazing record of geologic history and how that's built up for Mercury over time. And Mercury is absolutely covered with faults that we'll look at in a minute. And with the map on the right, we're looking at these different compositional areas. If you look at Rachmaninoff, for example, and Caloris, both of those are impact basins. Their composition is really different. And if you look at them in terms of crustal thickness, they're both in areas of relatively thin crust. So learning about tectonics for tectonic's sake, or learning about geologic structures for their own sake, those two basins could be a really interesting place to test how composition affects tectonics, because you've controlled for crustal thickness, and now you get to look at just how composition affects your structures. So tectonics, especially for Mercury, is an amazing tool to investigate its geologic past. We use tectonics to learn about the geologic history of Mercury. We use it to think about the stresses and sources of stress for the planet. So those can come from internal or external stresses. So they could come from volcanism, it could come from mantle convection. Upwelling and downwelling both produce stresses, and if those stresses build to a certain point in the surface and overcome the strength of the rock, then you'll end up with tectonic features. You can have stresses from impact cratering, from changes in orbit, from changes in spin. All of those processes will build stress in the crust. And eventually, if the stress is to a sufficient magnitude to exceed the strength of the rock, you will get faults out of that. And also, they give you a really great opportunity for collaboration. So those two maps we saw in the beginning, those have nothing to do with tectonics, with structure. But if you tie them together, the Mercury community especially, being so really well connected with MEXAG and through opportunities like this, you can build collaboration opportunities with tectonics. And it's all while being a tool that you learn about in structural geology. So it's something that if you're coming through a geology program, you're maybe gaining those skills even during your bachelor's, which is great. This is a map of Mercury tectonics that's produced in 2014. And I like using this particular map because when you think about observation versus interpretation, this map is really heavily relying on observation with planetary structures. So it talks more about where the structure is located versus what it actually looks like and what it would be interpreted to be. So for example, all of these areas in purple are the smooth plains units. And so all the structures that lie within there are primarily called smooth plains structures. All of the cratered plains are in white, and the structures that are cutting the cratered plains are in blue. Basin crater related structures are in orange, and these are structures that kind of follow the outsides of impact crater rims, whether those be filled with smooth plains or not. And then high terrain bounding structures in the dark blue. So this is more about where those structures are versus some kind of interpretation of their formation. There's also these features over here, which go into interpretation a little bit. They're mapped with symbology that implies that there are anticlines and synclines through the Chloris Basin and just outside of that. And these are really long wavelength features where the topography rolls up and down. So I say this in contrast to using the terminology lobate scarp and wrinkle ridge and high relief ridge. I won't be using that language today. If you're familiar with it, wrinkle ridges are typically referred to as lower relief structures. They're a little bit shorter. They're a little bit irregular. They anastomose in their plan form. They can be symmetric. They can change vergence. So the direction of tectonic transport, that direction of asymmetry can vary. And those are primarily located in smooth plains. Lobate scarps are typically long, higher relief, asymmetric ridges. They're less complicated in plan form. They still form in groups, but just with less or fewer changes in vergence. And those tend to be focused in the cratered plains. But the boundary between those two groups is really subjective. So I'm not going to talk about those two groups today. I'll just refer to all of these as being thrust fault related landforms. They are all tectonic landforms. They likely all have a thrust. They're all, or an anticlinal fold. They're all accommodating shortening. And so that's the preferred language for Mercury when we talk about that. When we first start mapping on Mercury and talking about the tectonic history of Mercury, it's important to know what we're working with. So we typically use topography and imagery to start the mapping process, as well as GIS, which I know you guys are learning about. Just like every other planet, Mercury has its own projections and its own way to use GIS with it. And then you're also starting with your structural geology knowledge and everything you got in class. So we can look at how data has changed over time in terms of our ability to visualize thrust fault related landforms. This is Discovery Rupus. This is from the Mariner 10 mission 1974 and 1975. And this is the same feature, but from Messenger, which ran from 2008 to 2015. If we're interested in learning about Discovery Rupus, which of these images is better? Which of these data sets serves us more?
I think the image from the Messenger Prof had a better resolution.
Yeah, there is no denying that Messenger has much better resolution. That image is really, really crisp. What if my goal is to produce a map where I'm hoping to eventually, if you're familiar with strike, it's just the trend of the landform, where my goal is to capture the noise in the strike of the landform or really get a good, precise map of where that fault meets the surface. Is the Messenger data, even though it's newer, even though it's crisper, is it still better?
I think the left image would be better to understand the detail. For example, because I see that the infill of a crater can be seen better.
Down here?
No, the crater in the southeast part of the image, and in the other image it's almost half of it in shadow.
Absolutely. So thank you guys for participating. I really appreciate that. So it's not always going to be about image quality when you're working with structure. Illumination is really important. especially because for structure and tectonics, our landforms are pretty linear. And so as they dip down, as those linear features dip down into impact craters, shadowing is really problematic for mapping. And especially because impact craters can be so helpful. I mean, it's basically a zone of decreased strength in the material and predictable decreased strength in materials. So as the fault cuts across this landform, for example, if we watch this fault cut across this impact crater, we can start to think about differences in the fault, differences in how it's grown, because we know that we're moving through zones of relative strength, relative weakness, and then relative strength, relative weakness, and understanding how a fault propagates through those different strength regimes kind of helps you understand how it grew. So you want to make sure that you're considering all illuminations when you're working with structure and tectonic mapping. So what do we know about Mercury's tectonic landscape? And I'm especially going to highlight papers that I think, as we talk through this, papers that I think have done a really good job of being careful with illumination angles. And I didn't mean to say that. This totally makes me seem not humble at all, because I'm going to start with my own work. But I'm really careful with this stuff. So starting with smooth plane structures, there are some patterns that we can see emerge in the way that smooth plane structures show up. So they show up as impact crater bounding features. They're typically thrust faults that verge outward. So they're starting, their roots are kind of underneath the center of an impact crater and they're coming out. Even when the impact craters are flooded, we still see folds around the rims of those buried impact craters. We also see symmetric features. So these are features that would have thrust faults verging outward on both sides, and that creates a symmetric topography. The topography, I'm emphasizing that it's symmetric because we so often think about thrust fault related topography as being asymmetric, but there are back thrusts that are incredibly important in understanding tectonic structures, and those show up pretty frequently for Mercury in the smooth plains. We see systems of structures, so these definitely aren't isolated landforms. They can either be systems of linear structures or systems of arcuate structures that all seem to be related with similar vergence. And we can then go into the subsurface and kind of understand how the faults are related. So we can use structure-related software that's for industry on Earth. We can make DEMs combined with imagery for Mercury's surface. We can slice those with cross sections after we've mapped our fault related features, and then do some subsurface interpretation based on topography. Remember, we need that topography. Based on that subsurface interpretation, relating it back to topography to see what might be below the surface. And then we can thread those interpretations together to create 3D surfaces that show the faults that might be working together to produce those landforms. So for example, in this figure, there's 4 different faults working together with two main faults, of a main thrust and a back thrust, working together to uplift that terrain. And in doing this type of modeling, we can measure the amount of strain that's associated with these features. So we now know that that strain is a little bit underestimated currently for Mercury, and that's because models for Mercury's faults typically haven't explicitly included folding. And now with better software, we can start to say folding matters, and here's how much strain folding is accommodating. When you move into the cratered plains, a whole new opportunity opens up that has to do with dating. So in the northern smooth plains and in smooth plains in general, those terrains are a little bit younger. They've been volcanically resurfaced. The structures cutting them are younger than the volcanic resurfacing. In the older crater plains, you have a longer history of these landforms building up together with impact craters. So you can start to think about stratigraphic relationships of faults with impact craters. And what we know is that from looking at that and from dating impact craters, that there's been a long history of tectonism on Mercury. Not all of these structures are young, and they're also not old, that it's long-lived, and that tectonism was really prevalent early in Mercury's history and has kind of slowed down toward present day. And we can also use this area to start to think about compositions in the terrain. And we talked about this on the first slide, but how the development of those different terrains can result in localization of thrusts. This is one of my favorite figures because you can see through time the relationship between a high density region with high magma productivity being related to the formation of these thrust faults. So we definitely have good enough resolution in different terrains to link faults and terrains together. The great thing about this too, and being able to study the locations of these features, is that it helps us understand all of the things that we can't see. So in this slide, it's kind of understanding the timing of when faults develop, that what we can't see is the stuff that formed a long time ago, those faults that are cut by really old impact craters. And this is about understanding things we can't see in terms of rheologic layering and into the subsurface. A fault, as it comes down, it loves to root into boundary zones, places where you have rheological boundaries or stratigraphic boundaries, where you have high and low strength contrasts in rock. So if you work on Earth and you think about a décollement, you might think about décollement that roots into a schist or like a salt-rich layer, something that's weak in contrast to the layers around it. Same thing is going to happen on other planets. You can start to predict where these faults are going to root into and what their layering might be. So for example, here, the roots might be into regions where you have a different composition. In the smooth plains region, we see faults that root down into that boundary layer between the smooth plains and the material that it covered, which would have been similar to intercrater plains. We can also learn about the depth that structures go to and their dip by looking at the topography and doing some finite element modeling. This is from Egea Gonzalez. And the blue line here is the topography that's associated with one of the thrust fault features. And then they try to reproduce that topography with finite element models with faults that go down to different depths. This is something that's a little bit better to do in the crater plane structures because they're a little bit simpler and you're not always having to worry about back thrusts and things like that. And we see dips that are pretty predictable for features related to thrust faults, so dips near 30 degrees, and depths that go a lot deeper than they do in the smooth plains. So smooth plane structures probably root to something less than 10 kilometers depth, whereas these features are rooting down closer to 30 kilometers or deeper. Don't see a lot of normal faults on Mercury. Where we do see them, they're pretty much confined to impact basins. And the normal faults are accommodating extension on Mercury. It's not a global kind of extension. It's extension kind of in the way that the top of a cheesecake cracks when you bake it, that you've got some separation when an impact basin gets flooded, and that contributes to concentric graben. If you have uplift in the center of a basin, like that's happened here with Caloris, that also can contribute to extension as that uplift is happening and cracking radially. The hard part here, and the reason why normal faults are still worth investigating, is if I were looking at this picture, this is Apollodorus crater, which is right in the middle of this ring graben system, and it's also right in the middle of the Caloris basin. If I were looking at this, I might start to think that Apollodorus is somehow genetically related to the graben system, or rather in reverse. The graben system is related to the impact that formed the Apollodorus crater. I might also start to think maybe there's dikes I mean, to me, this looks a little bit like a dike swarm. Maybe there's a dike swarm in the subsurface and magma has filled and then relaxed and the cavities have collapsed on top of that and created a radial dike swarm. I've mapped those in the Raton Basin in Southeast Colorado. But here, those hypotheses were investigated, and it was found that this is related to doming that happened in the center of the Caloris Basin. So normal faulting is limited on Mercury. Long wavelength topography is also limited. From Kay and Dunbar 2019, we now know that these are probably not folds. They're probably not tectonic in nature, that instead these changes in topography where you see highs and lows are more likely to be related to different levels of mantle support. So maybe some upwelling pushing the material up and downwelling, or delamination pulling material down, the delamination then allowing things to kind of snap back up. So these are not really supposed to be tectonic with our current interpretation. When we have all of those observations together, now we can start to think about what we're learning about Mercury's geologic history. So super basic facts that we learned is that Mercury's cooling and contracting. So the tectonics, especially starting in the 70s, you know, it's sparsely sampled. You're not getting to see a global population of faults from Mariner 10. But from what researchers saw, they felt that the whole surface was covered in thrust fault related landforms. So the whole surface had to represent shortening. And that's kind of what you would expect in a simple planet that doesn't have a lot of plate tectonics, that when it's young and hot, it's expanding, the crust is cracking apart, maybe you form graben systems, but then as that planet cools, its radius shrinks. And as that radius shrinks, all of the outside cold, brittle lithosphere is responsible for accommodating that shortening. So you're going to form lots of thrust faults, and the amount of thrust faults that you see and the amount of strain that you're saying that those faults represent, that gives you a way to talk about the radius change in the surface. So here, Solomon 1977 says that there's a period of time where the radius increases. That's talking about this really hot period where the planet's molten and expanding in its interior. And then you have a downturn over time, and that planet cools and shrinks and your radius gets smaller. We can also look at that with modern data sets. So I did that with messenger data because we did have a global data set. And because we have a global data set, I was able to derive global average strain rates for each of these time periods. And I did this by time based on stratigraphic relationships between impact craters and faults. So really old faults are going to be cut by old craters, really young faults cut by young craters. And you can use that system of stratigraphic interpretation to create this idea of how the radius is shrinking with time. So we know using tectonics that the radius was shrinking, or strain was operating at faster rates earlier in Mercury's history, in the Calorian especially, and that it slowed down toward present day. And then you can go even more in depth than that and start looking at specific systems and thinking about when specific systems were active using buffered crater counting techniques. So here, for example, there's 5 systems that have been dated by Giacomini et al. In 2020, where individual thrust systems were dated. And this kind of narrows that range down to an even narrower window, that these specific systems are active around 3.6 to 3.8 billion years ago. And I think this is really cool, and this is underutilized. We could be learning a lot more about where specific systems have been active through Mercury's history by doing more of this type of technique. We also learn about the unique terrains and that Mercury has evolved with volcanism. So for example, by dating the faults in the smooth plains units, we can define a younger limit on smooth plains. We wouldn't be able to see the faults if they were covered up by the volcanics. but we get to see them. We can think about the compositional boundaries, that this is the high magnesium boundary, and it is totally bounded by faults on this side. Same with the crustal thickness map, that this is a higher crustal thickness, and we've got faults bounding on both sides of that. So those faults, because they are in those boundary zones, they must have come after, or they are genetically related to in some way those specific regions. So Mercury is building unique terrains, and the faults are kind of highlighting those terrains and giving us an opportunity to look at how extensive they are in depth. Also, faults are basically cracks in the surface. So they are a great way to get a conduit and to get material to the surface. And that's what Christian Klensack and I did in 2018 with this map. We looked at vents, so places where little pyroclastic explosions had made it to the surface, and tried to relate those to areas with increased fault density. And we found that really mature old faults and fractures, whether they're fractures because they formed with impact cratering, or whether they're fractures because it's a fault that we observe, that those cracks are helping volcanic material get to the surface. And we can learn that stresses may have originated from more than cooling. And this is primarily done through modeling, but it can also be done through mapping. These are models that are produced that kind of tell you what you would expect. So the blue lines are strikes, and they're the strikes of structures that you would expect from combinations of global contraction, 1 kilometer of global contraction, tidal despinning, so the planet actually slowing down its rotation, that builds stress. And we think that that has potentially happened for Mercury, and I'll talk about that in a second. And also reorientation due to calorus. So here the black circle is the old pole. Up at the top is the new pole. And then this is the gravity center. This open circle is the gravity center of calorus. So the idea in this paper was that when calorus impacted, that locally it caused stresses, which led to the reorientation of Mercury. And so together, all of those 3 processes would result in specific tectonic patterns. And if you're looking at these, the cool thing about modeling is it's giving you the opportunity to compare what you see with what's there. So I'm gonna jump down here for a second. This is a map from 2019 of every fault-related landform in the smooth plains, the northern smooth plains units, and where dark blue indicates more landform length and light blue is less, and they're plotted as rose diagrams to show you the orientation. Here, I think at least that we see a transition from east-west striking features around the poles, still coming down, still seeing east-west, and once we make it to kind of the upper mid-latitudes, seeing a north-south strike. That is not really what we see in these examples of reorientation, and that should probably be investigated more, and I know how I would do it. It's just like a time thing. So, but comparing the patterns that we see to the patterns that are expected can help us understand what's happening. And this pattern in particular is what is predicted for the planet having slowed its rotation down. So tidal despinning could have played a role on Mercury in building those stresses. If you think back to the long wavelength features from earlier, this could potentially be an explanation for that, is linking them to mantle convection. These are mantle convection models from King 2008. And to me, these like linear features kind of remind me of spots where you could have upwelling and downwelling in the mantle.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
So my name is Adomas Valentinas, and I'm interested in, have you looked at wrinkle ridges on the moon? Because wrinkle ridges on the moon are very different, and also the orientations that they follow and the patterns that they make on wrinkle ridges on the surface of the moon are very different also from Mercury. Have you looked into that?
I haven't. I've never done research on that, but when I have looked at like imagery from the moon, to me, those wrinkle ridges, if we're gonna use the term wrinkle ridges and not thrust fault related landforms, those features to me seem much more subsidence related. Like the impact craters that have been filled, that as that material cools, subsides, and shortens, that those features, those landforms are what is taking up that shortening. For Mercury, the wrinkle ridges to me look a lot cleaner. They're a lot more distinct. They have more interesting orientation patterns that suggest that they are related to something beyond subsidence, in my opinion. But I will talk more. If you would like to know, we can talk more about that in a minute.
Yeah, sure. We can continue later. Yeah.
Cool. So,
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I have a question on a previous slide? And you were speaking about trust and enlightening the fact that every trust has got a detachment layer, and speaking about the planes as the footwall. So I didn't understand which was the analog of the detachment layer on Mercury.
Oh, great question. So for the inner crater plane structures, I don't really know what the detachment layer would be there. It's maybe some form of rheologic layering, but I don't know. For the smooth plane structures, so if you think about how Mercury's surface was evolving through time, everything probably originally started out as inner crater planes, and all of those are most likely volcanically in place. They're old, they've had time to develop, they're preserving all of their weaknesses and cracks through time in them. And then just in the northern hemisphere, mostly in the northern hemisphere, you then get flooding of those terrains through new volcanics around 3.7 billion years ago. And that's how you're getting your smooth plains units. When the inner crater plains was still being impacted, but before that volcanism had set in, you can develop a regolith layer. So you've got a nice weak layer, gritty, I'm not sure how thick it would be. I don't know exactly how long it would have had the chance to develop in the northern hemisphere, but a regolith thin layer, a weak layer is expected. And so if you think about having a strong volcanic layer, a weak regolith layer, and then another 4 kilometers of new volcanics, you are definitely going to see a strength contrast between your new fresh volcanics and your regolith layer right below it. And that layer could serve as your root, as your décollement.
All right, thank you. I think I've got the point.
Cool.
And last question on this slide, actually. You were speaking about convective movements in the mantle. And I was thinking, can we expect something like hotspots related to structures?
It would be, so if I'm thinking about the relationship between hotspots and structures, or a mantle plume and a structure, I'm probably gonna be looking for places where I might have extension, or I might have uplift that's more due to like Plutonism than it is to tectonics. So looking for rises that aren't necessarily structurally related, because when I think about a plume that would be developing on Mercury, the lithosphere is not moving, right? Or maybe it was at one point, but if it's not moving today, that's just super thick. As that plume comes up and it hits that super thick lithosphere, just like a plume that comes up and hits a craton, you're going to have stalling that happens. And as that plume kind of works heat-wise on the bottom of that craton, you could have delamination, and then that delamination might eventually let some of that volcanics get to the surface. So, for example, crustal thicknesses between the northern and southern hemisphere if the northern hemisphere is just thinner and you have not necessarily more plumes, but you have more cell upwellings, then you are getting an opportunity to delaminate thinner lithosphere, an opportunity to break into the surface a little bit easier. And that maybe that's why you have your northern smooth plains being so prevalent, but nothing in the south. So I think maybe not necessarily narrowing yourself to plumes, but looking at all implications of mantle upwelling and heat generation in the base of the lithosphere and delamination, looking at all of those links together would be worth doing.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Great questions. So to me, and this is where I wanted to wrap up, the hardest part to get started in any science, but also in Mercury tectonics, is to find your question, right? Like that can be an incredibly intimidating thing. So for Mercury science, for Mercury tectonics, we think about where we're going. There are tons of open questions. And like I just listed some of my favorites here. Pick your open question, you pick your tool set and your approach, and you pick your collaborators, right? So how is strain accommodated today? Are there, I know there's active faults on Mercury, but are they reactivating old faults too? Or are we making new faults? How has faulting changed over time? Why are the smooth plains units in the north and what are their sources? I think that's really cool. What were the earliest stresses on Mercury like? So the stresses that we're building back then, are they localized different? Are they from different sources than what we have today? And specifically despinning, so slowing down the planet's orbit or spin, reorientation, mantle convection, all of those processes probably affected tectonism, but when did they do it and how did they do it? And then for Bepi Colombo, which should be bringing back data in 2025, how does the southern hemisphere deform differently? I think this is going to be cool because we have imagery of the southern hemisphere, but we need higher quality topography to do really great modeling. We have that for the north, but we don't have that for the south. So that contrast is going to be fun. Then you pick your tool set or your approach. It's just like Earth geology. Which features are you going to look at? What measurements are you going to take? What data sets do you need? And is your problem that you're addressing local, regional, or global in scale? And then picking your team. So to answer your question, what specialties need to be represented? Do you need a geochemist, geomorphologist, a geophysicist? Whose voices need to be heard? And this is important for diversity and inclusivity, but it's also important to listen to Earth geologists. So I feel like my experience going through planetary has sometimes discounted people who do Earth work. Like I'm a traditional field geologist. I go outside and look at orogenies. I love mountain building. I don't care what planet it's on. But sometimes I feel like maybe I'm not going to be taken as seriously because I spend more time looking at rocks in the field, and not as much time modeling. But those people are really important. They've got a wealth of what rocks should look like in their head. They've got a lot of intuition to contribute to the community about what faults probably do and don't look like based on their experience of actually seeing faults in the field. And then what resources and equipment do you need? I think a lot of these questions can be addressed with machine learning. And so thinking about choosing a lab that has more computing resources or field equipment, whatever it is you want to do is going to be important. So what I had hoped that we might have time for is for y'all to take 2 minutes and find one of these questions that really resonates with you and start to think about what your tool set or what your approach would be. And then I'm going to ask some of you to share in a minute. Am I okay to do that for the people that are leading this?
I think we can work for some minutes more. So
Okay.
please go on.
So just, I know I've run over and I apologize, but if you just take 2 minutes, find a question that really resonates with you, that'd be great. Does anybody have a question that really stands out to them as something that they would want to pursue?
Okay, hello. My name is Valentin. I will say that why are the smooth planes units in the north?
Yeah, that I love that question. Did anybody else choose that one?
Yes, me too.
Yeah, me too. Here, yeah. Actually,
Cool.
yeah.
Great. So if you're going to address that with tectonics, what features are you going to map? And what would you measure on them, do you think? Because the reason why I ask, I don't think the answer is only smooth plane structures.
I think even about distribution of masses on the planet.
Yeah.
If it's possible that the north, it's the north because there are the plains and a less thicker crust.
Yeah. So, and it's not, to me, it's, so there is that geophysical component, there's crustal thickness, but I think also when you say, why are the smooth plains units in the north? The question you're not asking is, why aren't the smooth plains in the south? And I think if you looked at the distribution of smooth plains structures of tectonics in the north and in the south, like do the polar opposite. If you, when that Bepi-Colombo data comes back, especially if you can start to contrast those structures, that could be really interesting, because any whole body, any whole body reason why that's going to happen should have been affected both sides. Even if it's like the reorientation due to Caloris, if Caloris is kind of ripping and pulling the northern hemisphere down and opening that system up, you still might expect something happening on the other side of the planet. So maybe contrasting those two. So in terms of team, it sounds like you're going to need a geophysicist, you're going to need a geochemist for that. You're definitely going to need a structural geologist. You can do mapping and contrast those landforms. But that's, to me, this is how you start the process of making tectonic science less intimidating. It's really just finding yourself a workflow like this. So with that,
and sorry, Kelsey, if I may add a comment on this very interesting exercise that you proposed. I think that anybody trying to answer one of these questions will end up trying answering all the other questions, because I think they are all linked together and they require an interdisciplinary study. Yeah. So as soon as I asked myself why smooth plains are in the north, I asked myself, so why aren't they in the south? And so why the southern hemisphere deform differently? Because it does. And so I think that anybody would end up asking him or herself all of these questions. So this is very interesting job.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of interesting too. And shameless plug, I am looking for graduate students for fall of 2023. I'm having another baby this summer, so I'm not going to take new grad students in fall 2022. But this is kind of how we run the lab here. I run the lab here is that we are all kind of thinking about interdisciplinary questions, and our tool set or our approach is Earth analog analysis and modeling and mapping and statistics. And you can't just stop with one question, and you can't just stop with one approach. you're going to end up with an integrated team.
Can I ask, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask things because I'm not really a participant, but I was wondering, you were saying how the different regimes in the North and South Pole. Now, my kind of understanding of it is that the North Pole may have had kind of flooding by the Borealis planitia. And so actually looking at the South Pole, we might be seeing, preservation of more ancient tectonics. But does that mean that that's a different tectonic regime, or could it just be that it's the same regime, but in the North it's been kind of flooded and we don't see it in the same way?
Yeah, the answer is yes. But what you would want to do to go about that's really cool, is the structures that made it to the surface in the North have to be younger, or the stresses that built them have to be younger than the plains. So you would want to go to the Southern Hemisphere and target your younger structures. So yes, either through a buffered crater counting technique or through a stratigraphic correlation. And then you'd want to do just a direct comparison. So one thing would be cool, especially if you're trying to incorporate machine learning, is map all of them and hide yourself a little code in there that says, these are my northern plain structures, these are my southern structures, right? But then see if statistically you can differentiate between those groups of features. There's a machine learning technique called k-means, and you could see, are there ways that I can differentiate between these types of structures without telling myself where they are in terms of latitude and longitude. Mm-hmm. And if you can start to differentiate those populations, then that tells you that the tectonic regime isn't the same in the North and the South. But if you can't, then you can't. And you'd have to be really careful to not measure things like height that's going to be affected by them having cut through, or displacement that's going to be affected by them having cut through the smooth plains. You'd want to focus on density of structures and orientation, which then would make your work a lot easier anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I could ask a quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned about Earth analog study, and I see a lot of Earth analog studies to do with Mars, and I see a lot of Earth analog studies to do with even Venus as well. You don't see a huge amount of Earth analog studies with Mercury. I don't know, so could you sort of illuminate me on the sorts of Earth analog studies you might do for Mercury?
Sure. So in our group, we definitely work in the Columbia River basalts. We've looked at work in the Yakima Fold Belt, which is Waters 1988, I think, had kind of done some superficial work on looking at the orientation of structures and what they were interpreted to be at the time, and then using that to think about just wrinkle ridges in general and what their features are. But that area is actually really applicable to the northern plains of Mercury in central Washington, because you see so many of the same geomorphologic features associated with the tectonism. So like the Frenchman Hills, for example, you see changes in vergence, you see anastomosing landforms, and no one's worked on the Frenchman Hills. It's just a really cool area. I worked on some of the folds that are south of that, the Monastash, Umtanum, and Saddle Mountains anticlines, that are a little bit bigger and might remind you a little bit of like Le Dauphine Rupes. Farther south, in Oregon, one of my master's students and I have worked there on how dikes make it to the surface in a compressive stress regime, right? Which is incredibly important for Mercury because the northern plains got there somehow. And so you had to have a dike system that got that material to the surface. But when the heck did you have stresses that opened enough to let you actually get material to the surface? And so she and I used some dike modeling in southeastern Oregon, because we knew that those areas were initially compressive. They were compressive and experiencing shortening while the dikes were being emplaced. So we specifically looked there to be able to think about dikes making it to the surface in the Calorian period of Mercury. The other place that we've been working, and this is a newer project with our group, is in the Wichitas in Arkansas. Those are hopefully something that we can extend to Mercury and Mars, but they're important because they represent an area of intracontinental deformation that was reactivated over time. So we're specifically looking there to look at how mantle scarring continues to be reactivated and continues to affect what surface geology looks like. So early Earth analog work, I think, focused a lot on the geometry of structures. What's their depth? What's their depth? What does it look like on the inside? And I think now we can kind of work past that and ask more process-related questions, like how do you get a dike to the surface when only thrust faults are forming around it? Can a dike cut a thrust and in one stress regime and make that possible? Or can you have mantle upwelling? What does mantle upwelling look like in a compressive environment? So you can ask more process related questions now, I think, than people were doing before.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah. I feel bad because I know we've run over a lot, but I have my email up here. I would love questions. If you are looking for a graduate program in 2023, email me, but expect to do some field work with your planetary.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. That was so interesting and exciting seeing your work all together. And what I would like to say to the students that if you will study Mercury's tectonics, you for sure you will end up reading Kelsey's paper. So this is you are so lucky to have her with us today. So and I really appreciated the review of Mercury's tectonics and all the literature you showed us. And I have a question in mind. Do you think Mercury structures are more affected by ancient impacts or by a bad mixing of the mantle?
I think that they're probably more affected by ancient impacts than we think, but I don't want to give away a paper that we.
Yeah. Well, I think we lost
her. We just there's your Georgia named Ishik who has written a really cool paper and is so close to it going and being submitted. So that would be an Icarus. But besides the point, yes, I think that looking for those for evidence of where the ancient impacts are and then relating those to fault orientation is a productive research path for future work.
And I agree, because when I wrote the paper in 2019, I ended up thinking that the high magnesium region was indeed an ancient impact region.
Yes. Yeah. And it's really hard not to, well, it's an ancient impact, but you know how it has almost like that seashell shape to it? I know that's weird, but it looks like an upside down seashell. Okay.
Yeah.
It's almost like you had an impact, but you must have had some kind of active tectonics or other process at the same time that flattens that front part out. Or maybe it's oblique and that's giving it a different shape. I think, yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, just another question. So if impacts with very big objects may affect the composition that we see today in different areas.
Yes. So is your question whether or not we can see those compositional changes today, like why we would suspect an impact based on compositional differences?
No, it's more like, yeah, more or less like this. Sorry, my English is not very perfect, but what I was imagining is that sometimes we can see differential presence of elements, and if we see it on the Earth, maybe we see iridium and we think, all right, that's the meteorite that extincted dinosaurs and things like this now. So we hypothesize an impact. If we have got a composition of the mantle of Mercury, and so the differentiation of the crust, we can know if we see on the crust the major presence of some elements, maybe it's been not addicted, summed by something coming from outside.
I see your point.
Oh, yes.
No, I think Francesco meant that can we see an element signature or impacts on planetary surfaces or on Mercury, I guess. I don't think we have enough resolution right now.
All right.
But if Kelsey wants to add something.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the reason why the high magnesium region in particular stands out to me as potentially from an impact isn't so much of because of what material is brought in, it's that you create an opportunity to release your stress and then let the early mantle come up, and that early mantle is going to have a higher magnesium number than what you would expect for today. I want to fully admit to something. When I wasn't, because I'm sure there are undergrads in here, hopefully there are. When I was an undergrad, I had no idea how you flooded an impact basin. How in the heck are you supposed to get volcanic material to the surface? Like, are you punching a hole through a planet? How does it get up there? And so when we say that these areas are flooded or that we're accessing mantle melt and bringing that back up, or lower crustal melt and bringing that up into impact basins, it literally just means that you have pushed the impact crater down, you're lifting that surface back up. As the surface rebounds, you get decompression melting. So if you think about a PT diagram, you're lowering your pressure so you don't need higher temperatures in order to melt. And then that melt is then able to work its way up through all the cracks that you created through the impact. And that's what sits and fills inside your impact crater. And so if you have a really old mantle that hasn't gone through a long history of partially differentiating and like depleting itself, then you're going to be able to bring magnesium rich material up to the surface when you get that decompression melting. So if you're an undergrad,
from olivine
coming from.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
Are there any other questions for Kelsey? So I think it's 9:20 p.m. here. So I think we had a great Mercury day. And this was a very interesting talk. So I thank you again. I hope we can stay in touch to have some discussion another time. And if I understand well, you will have another baby. So congratulations.
Yes, I've got a 5-year-old, and then I'm due again in June. So I've got another one on the way. And I know there's questions in the chat. I'm actually going to have to go to a geology team meeting. If you've got a question for me and you direct message me in the chat, or you just have one, can you please send me an email and I'll get back with y'all. I've got to run.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.